Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Onboarding is such an important part of an employee's success. It starts well before the employee decides to apply with an organization in the form of employment branding and the candidate experience. It includes sourcing, interview, background checks, and extending the job offer. Next comes that paperwork we love so much, new hire paperwork, orientation, and training. Lastly, performance management. We're talking about all things onboarding, and at some point, onboarding touches every component of the employee life cycle. I am joined today with a wonderful guest, Charlaines. You might know her as the author or blog owner of HR Bartender, but she's also another author of Manager Onboarding, 5 Steps for Setting New Leaders Up for Success. Charlaines, talk a little bit about your new book and a little bit about your background.
Okay. Well, background first. I'm an HR pro, spent the majority of my professional career in human resources. I grew up in some really interesting fields, at least I consider them to be interesting: theme parks, hotels, and airlines. My last corporate job was VP of HR for a global organizational consulting firm, and I've been a consultant now for about 15 years. I'm also the author of the blog HR Bartender, and I usually try to explain to people where the name HR Bartender comes from, but I always thought as an HR pro people wanted me to act like a bartender, so that's where the name comes from. The book Manager Onboarding it was published by SHRM, and it kind of came into being because I was having a conversation with SHRM about what are some of the things that people ask about the most in the SHRM Knowledge Center. And they came back and said, Manager Onboarding. And I was like, really? I said, I wouldn't have suspected that that was a topic that people wanted to know about. So I really took it as a personal challenge to go out there and find out what's happening with manager onboarding and design a book that someone could take off the shelf and design their own manager onboarding program. So the book is really a practical guide to say, if you want a blueprint for designing a manager onboarding program, here it is.
So let's talk about manager onboarding and what's involved with that first, to kind of give people maybe a little bit of background before they picked up the copy of the book.
What I found, what's so interesting is we put a lot of responsibility on managers in an organization. You know, if you think about that old cliche, people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. We load up their plate, we give them the responsibility of training and engaging and retaining our workforces. But often we don't give managers the same tools that we give new hire employees. So, a new hire employee a new employee comes on board, and we send them through orientation and we put them in an onboarding program to set them up for success. But a lot of times when a manager gets promoted from within or comes into the organization, we don't give them the same things. We give them the company orientation, great, but a lot of the things that are unique to being a manager, they have to figure them out by making a mistake. I hate to say it, but I've been in this place a few times in my career where a manager makes a mistake and then the answer is, oh, well, you weren't supposed to do it that way, you were supposed to do it this way. And that's how managers learn their job. So why not have a program that allows managers to know the things that they need to know and set them up for success? If we train managers or if we onboard managers well, they will know how to onboard their employees well.
This sounds a lot like something that other managers, maybe more seasoned managers that you have on your team, might be able to help provide input because they have experienced themselves onboarding, learning, the learning curve that a new manager has. So they might be a great starting point, or at least a place for collaboration for you as you're developing your program.
Absolutely. I think if you're looking at designing a manager onboarding program, think about that assessment. And I would go out to managers and say, what is it that you wish you would have known, when day one or after 30 days or 60 days in, and find out that information, because that's the basis of your manager onboarding program. And let me say, when we talk about manager onboarding, that is not the replacement or a substitute for your leadership and management development programs within your organization. Those programs are terrific and you should keep them, but often when you go to a leadership or a management development program, what you learn in those programs, you can immediately apply on the job. A lot of qualities in leadership and management development, regardless of your job title, you can immediately apply that knowledge and skills in your current position. Manager onboarding is the idea that there are these things that the minute your title becomes manager, you need to know that don't have anything to do with management and leadership development. Often when you get promoted, the ethics might change because you're responsible for contracts and maybe you weren't responsible for contracts before. Maybe you need to know how to be an administrator in a payroll program or a human resources technology solution because now you're going to have a different level of responsibility. So those things are things that you might want to consider putting in your manager onboarding program, because those are the things that managers need to know the first day they become a manager. They don't need to know them in the manager development programs, but they do need to know them the minute that they sign on the dotted line and become a manager.
I agree. I think about time off requests, like you said, processing time, maybe the discipline process where HR or their boss plays a role in reviewing and maybe providing coaching conversations and things. There's a lot of different areas that you could go into this. How long, in your research and in the book, do you think a manager onboarding program should be?
Some of that's really going to depend on the position. There are going to be managers who maybe have responsibility for a process, and then there are managers who might have a large staff. And you can adjust your, I think the great thing about manager onboarding is it could be very flexible. You mentioned a few seconds ago talking with existing managers within the organization. Manager onboarding does not have to look like your employee onboarding program, because it's possible that you don't promote managers or hire managers on a regular basis. So it could be a mentoring type program, it could be a coaching type program where you buddy manage a senior manager up with a more junior manager. So you look at those kinds of things and say, this is how the program would operate, but you'll want to customize that to the culture of your organization and how many people that you hire.
What are some of the biggest obstacles that you are seeing maybe in adopting a manager onboarding program? Because I think we all have a lot of great ideas, right? And maybe we start to build them, but how do we get the adoption in the organization and then keep those managers honest and wanting to be part of and going through that program?
If the organization does not have any type of manager onboarding program, I think that the biggest challenge you might face is trying to do too much. Start small. I don't think it's beneficial to do one of everything. So you might be sitting back and saying, I need this and I need this and I need this. It's too much. You're trying to sell too much to senior management. You're trying to ask for too much in the budget. Maybe you don't have the bandwidth within your organization, within your department in order to get that done. So start small. Do one thing. Do it really well. Hit it out of the ballpark, and then go back and say, okay, now I'd like to add another piece. So take it slow and continue to build upon your successes. But I think that the biggest challenge could be trying to take on too much and then not doing anything well.
I mentioned before we hit record at the beginning of the podcast, this isn't a topic that I have written a lot about, but it sounds like that SHRM is getting a lot of requests for that kind of information. Do you think it's because there haven't been a lot of resources made available in terms of books or articles or blogs?
I agree with you in terms of not a lot out there. And it's so, the minute that somebody said manager onboarding to me, I'm like, oh my gosh, why are we not doing specific, we do management development programs, but why are we not doing manager onboarding programs to make sure that managers get all the resources that they need? So it was like a light bulb went off for me at the same time.
It makes so much sense, but I feel like sometimes in those gray areas where we're transitioning, an employee goes through orientation, they transition to employee, or an employee gets promoted to manager or hired on in, we skip those important foundational pieces and we go straight to the work. And then those are the areas that are so important, but they really just can cause a lot of frustration and stress and anxiety for that manager to keep them from being successful.
One of the things that I know in my career that I've seen companies make a mistake with is the idea that we hire the most competent person, technically competent person. We promote the most technically competent person, and we don't necessarily always give them the tools that they need in order to be successful. That's a challenge. That's a real challenge, not only for the organization, but for the manager. Managers really do want to do an excellent job, and they want to engage their workforce, but we have to give them all the tools.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast. Today we're talking with Charlaines Lobby, and we're talking about all things related to employee onboarding. You can connect with Charlaines on Twitter at HRBartender or Charlaines Lobby. Well, let's get back to it.
Employees' first 6 months is one of the most critical, but it's also the most productive, and managers have such a huge part in making that employee successful and being retained and maximizing their potential. So I definitely see how this manager onboarding, having an established program, would be of a benefit to an organization.
Part of it too is getting managers to understand what their role is within the organization. And when someone becomes a manager, they immediately have to think beyond the role that they have. I believe that managers are responsible for hiring and training their replacement. It's beneficial for the company. You need to have people in the pipeline, but managers cannot go out and do cool things for the organization and themselves if they do not have their house in order. So if you want to be on the CEO's pet secret project, if every time you walk out of your office, your department falls apart, you will never be able to do that. If you want to go to a conference, if you want to take any kind of time off, if every time you walk out of the building, your department doesn't know what to do, you will never get to, the goal of a manager isn't to be hands-on with every little thing in the organization. It's not to be indispensable. It's to train your team. And the only way that we're going to get managers there is if we explain to them on day one, this is your job and this is how you do it, and use that combination of onboarding and development in order to get them there.
This conversation to me is just kind of opening up my eyes because it just kind of gets often overlooked. But I feel like a lot of the things that you write about on the HR Bartender blog are those kind of things. They're no nonsense things. Sometimes we want to go to the sexiest and the coolest and the most interesting and like the hottest topic, like artificial intelligence, or we're looking at integration for our HR technology. You cover those things too, but then we talk about something like manager onboarding and a lot of the other resources that you have. They are foundational resources and basics that leaders need, whether they're HR or business leaders need, to be able to have profitable and businesses that are running well.
If organizations only had, a small pile of money to dedicate to stuff, development, it seems to me that putting it towards starting off well, whether it's employee onboarding or manager onboarding, but getting the basics, having people start off well. You mentioned the first 6 months, starting off that first 6 months well. Think about what your organization would be like from a performance perspective if the only thing you focused on was, I'm going to make sure that everybody's first 6 months is just incredibly awesome.
You spend all this time recruiting them, and you invest all this money, and and the time it takes to find these people and interview these people and make the selection, we really do need the first 6 months to be awesome.
SHRM, I think it's for 2016, but SHRM says that it costs at an average like $4,000 to hire somebody. Cost per hire, average cost per hire is $4,000, and I want to say 42 days. Don't quote me on that one, but you can Google it. And so what's interesting to me is you would spend 6 weeks hiring somebody and basically $4,000, $5,000 and then not give them the tools to be successful. It would be like you're just throwing all of that out the window.
Yeah, would you do that with $4,000 out of your bank account if it was your money? Absolutely not. I do feel like with managers, we are oftentimes in a situation where we need these people yesterday, right? So we need to get them immediately in the position, leading a team, doing what they need to do because headcount and maybe different business plans. But sometimes as a HR leader, a business leader, we have to step back and say, hey, I need this person for 4 hours just to kind of go over some basics, and then I'm going to meet with them once a week or once every 2 weeks to kind of go over housekeeping and this onboarding and get these things covered.
I agree with you, and I think one of the things that's interesting, you know, we're talking about cost per hire and time to fill and getting people on board. If your organization does any kind of interview skills training, I would recommend that you go through the cost per hire exercise at the beginning of interview skills training. Sit down with your managers, explain to them how you calculate cost per hire, go through, share the P&L. All the managers probably get the P&L anyway. Walk through how you calculate it, walk through what your company's cost per hire is, get everybody on board with what you think your cost per hire is, and then hand out your turnover report for the past year and explain to managers how many people have left their department and what they could do with that money. I've done this before, and managers, eye-opening to them, the thousands of dollars that are walking off out of the building, and it makes them realize I have to treat the hiring process and bringing talent into the organization. I have to put a dollar sign next to it.
It's a team effort. It's not just HR's job or the manager's job. We need to be working together. But I've found that when you do put a dollar number to it and you talk about investment, and is this investment, have you invested enough to be able to walk away from this employee? Oftentimes, if it's their money, the answer is no. But when it's the organization's money, the answer is yes. But if you get them kind of thinking that way, it changes a little bit, and they're like, wait, maybe I haven't done everything that I should be doing. This employee is driving me crazy, and I want him to go away, but maybe I didn't jump through the hoops and spend the time that I needed to make this employee successful.
Well, and I think it also, I know that we're kind of deviating a little bit from the topic of manager onboarding, but think about it from the standpoint of how does your organization make $4,000 decisions? And can you just walk into somebody's office and say, I want to spend $4,000? Because that's what you're talking about when you talk about, I want to get rid of this employee and I want to bring a new one on board. When somebody says to you, I want to spend $4,000, I don't know too many companies that just let you do that. Just bingo, spend $4,000. Don't have to have any documentation. Don't have to have any backup. Don't have to answer to anybody. It just doesn't work that way. So if you sort of mirror the process of how you spend $4,000 within your organization, then I think a lot of managers understand when HR comes back and says, okay, let's talk about this a little bit more. Let's talk about, what kind of documentation is in place and what's happening.
Well, I think this is the cost per hire conversation is something that you might be able to work into your manager onboarding too. It's probably a practice that you should do every year and remind your leaders, like you said, pulling out the turnover report, but you can introduce those concepts in the manager onboarding so they're already kind of in that mindset when they're hiring somebody. Is this worth $4,000?
And when we talk about metrics and measurement, I know that there's a lot of conversation out there about, cost per hire doesn't mean anything, turnover doesn't mean anything. These are some practical ways where if your management team isn't tuned into these kinds of metrics. You don't have to create big fancy metrics. Create, those standard 5 or 6, and get your team used to. So before you start talking predictive analytics, get the basics down and start introducing those to your management team, and then you can go from there.
Can you talk with us and tell us the story about how you ended up working in human resources? Because it's the most interesting HR story that I've ever heard.
So I worked for a company, and at the time that I worked for them, I had a job where I had a very physical job. I was outside, I was walking all the time, and I ended up getting into a car accident where I broke my back and I was in a full body cast. And luckily the company that I worked for, when I was ready to come back to work, said, we're gonna find a job that fits with your talents, and I ended up in HR. And I think that it's how I got into HR reminds me every day of how I think HR departments need to work. I believe that HR is the architect of work. We can look at people's talents and what's happening in the organization and the industry and the people that we're working with and say, how do we create good work for people? Because I feel like the organization that I worked for did that for me. So I think I need to do that for other people in the organization, whether the company is changing or individuals are saying, it's time for me to do something different, or their circumstances are forcing them to make a change.
I think you do that in your consulting work and then also through your blog, right? I think about your speaking and your writing and that those messages that you're sending, like look beyond, invest in your people, look at your people maybe a little bit differently than how you've been viewing them as your employee at this period of time.
Talent is just too hard to find, to sort of look at somebody and say, well, you can't do the job we hired you for, so you're just going to have to go do something else. Organizations need to think way, way beyond that and start making investments in people, and think about things like, manager onboarding programs to transition your team to the next level.
I think it's going to help prepare your leaders for maybe many years, hopefully to come, successful positions in your organization. Charlaine, where can people go to learn more about you and what you do?
The best way to find me is on HR Bartender, and it's just hrbartender.com.
All right, and we'll link to the Manager Onboarding book as well, and to the blog and some additional resources on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks so much, Charlaine, for taking the time to talk to us about a variety of different things, particularly onboarding and leaders and how they can get involved, and really helping them to understand how critical it is to effectively onboard, engage, and really build those relationships with your new hires, but those who are old-timers, if you will, experienced team members. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, you can visit workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes. Have a great day.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.